Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Each week, our hosts will be interviewing local, regional, and national business leaders to give you an inside peek into how they lead their business to success in the ever-competitive business climate.
Welcome to another episode of Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Richard Sanford of Dauntless Design Collaborative, which launched in 2009. Pleasure to speak with you, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay. Good to be on.
It is very nice to speak with you. You reached out to Alex following one of our last shows where you were mentioned in regards to laser scanning.
Yeah. No, I appreciated that shout out. And I found, it was something that's near and dear to my heart, the conversation you and Alex were having on that episode. And I found myself talking to both of you, talking back to both of you while I was listening to it. And obviously you guys could not hear me. So it's good to be on now, and we can have a chat about that and other things.
It is nice to close the loop. So in 2009, you kind of sailed off on your own. How did that go?
So like a lot of people at that time, I was working for a firm prior to 2009. So I worked for a firm in 2008, and then, went to school in Philadelphia and, had worked for a number of firms in those, 10 or 11 years that it was, and, got a lot of great experience that way. But, in 2008, I guess it was around June, I was working for a firm. We were doing large casino projects. So they really only had a large $2.5 billion casino in Atlantic City, and then another one that was, I believe, $4 billion. Did I say 2.5 million or billion? I think I said it is billion.
Big number.
Yeah. So, but then they had a $4 billion casino out in Vegas at the time. So, with the economy and all that stuff, obviously things were starting to shut down, and that was happening, on these projects as well. I know that, fast forward to whatever, 12 years later or whatever, the one that I worked on in Atlantic City has been built. It actually closed. That company claimed bankruptcy. Somebody else bought it, which is a story I can tell in a little bit about that. But so that building's open. But I know that the other project they worked on, that construction halted on that, and that company never finished it. And I think, somebody ended up coming in and buying that building. It was a shell of a building, 30-story tower or whatever. So, but everything was hit, with the economy. And the firm, I believe, had maybe 150 people. And, I think when all was said and done, they were down to maybe 20 or 30.
Wow.
But I call myself lucky, actually, because I was actually cut in I don't know if it was the first round of layoffs or what, but I think I was a little early, and I have my theories of why, and we don't have to really get into all of that.
The story behind Dauntless is pretty compelling. You can the little bio and the name that you chose. How did you jump into that?
So I was giving a little bit of backstory there because I got tied into, I got a job with a security consultant firm who was working on the casino project I was working on. And they, long story short with that was they hired me as a contract worker and convinced me. They were like, well, why don't you start your own company? So I had the light bulb moment went off, and I was like, oh, here's my opportunity, and the other thing about
that's a wonderful idea. Let's do that.
I still remember the moment because I was taking a train and then riding a bike about a half hour to get to their office. They weren't in the most, I went from working in Philadelphia where you get on a train, you walk a couple blocks and you're in your office, to working for the security consultant who is down near the Jersey Shore somewhere where, there was no trains nearby. And my wife and I at the time, we only had one car. And she needed the car. We had a 3 or 4 year old, at the time. So she used the car and I rode a bike, but I was sitting on the train platform, just riding a bike that day when the owner of that company was like, you should start your own company. And I was like, wait, here's the opportunity, and, I took the steps. That was late 2008. And then 2009, and, I started my company. It wasn't Dauntless Design Collaborative at the time. I kind of just used my own name at first. And then a few years later, I for a couple of years had the firm in Philadelphia. But then when I moved it back over to New Jersey, because I lived in a town close to Philadelphia, and then we moved further away from Philadelphia, and it was like a 3-hour commute back and forth total, that I just was like, this is silly. That's 3 hours I could spend. Yeah, I could spend, charging to a client and doing work. So I moved it back home for a period of time. But because of the licensure laws in between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, I couldn't keep what I had as a name. The name I had when I was in Pennsylvania was Sanford Architects, which is just my last name. But New Jersey wasn't allowing me to have that name because I was the only licensed architect in my firm. I mean, I'm the only person in my firm. I'm, solo practitioner basically. And so because it said architects plural, the state wouldn't let me use that. So then I had to figure out a way to come up with a new name, because I just didn't like the idea of like Richard Sanford Architect or anything like that. I just didn't like it. I wanted to have like some type of name. So I was thinking of a couple different things, but then my unfortunately, 2008 was a tough year, lost my job, but also my father-in-law had passed earlier in 2008. And my father-in-law was an aeronautical engineer. And when he retired, my mother-in-law and him, they moved up to Bar Harbor, Maine. And one of the things he did before retirement was he was hired to be part of the engineering team for America One, the America Cups, yacht race. And it was the year previous they had lost for the first time. So I guess they cleaned shop and got new engineers, and my father-in-law ended up becoming involved with them. I'm not sure exactly how, but he was on the engineering team. So when he moved to Bar Harbor after all of that experience, he started his own sailboat company, where he was just building like wooden 14 foot, 16 foot wooden sailboats, but he used all the engineering concepts from his experience with America One, and he named it Dauntless Enterprises. So when I was trying to think of a new name for my firm, I spoke to my mother-in-law, and I was like, look, I'd like to use the name Dauntless for my new firm, kind of in honor of your husband and things like that. And she agreed to that. So
it's a good name.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah. It also tied in with, I do MMA training as a hobby. Jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai. So Dauntless kind of has that kind of fighter type thing too. I think
honestly,
a little bit to it.
I'm sure you could speak to this. Going out and, forging your own way in the entrepreneur space, you do need to be dauntless. Like it's tenacity that is unique. You get into a lot of challenges that you don't think that you can overcome, and then somehow something happens and you can push through. Yeah. But it's healthy, I would say, to have that mindset going into it. And if you're, if you were speaking to your younger self, is that something that was part of inherent in your upbringing, or is this sort of going through your professional experiences you just had to acquire?
What, like the kind of in terms of always moving forward, or that type of attitude?
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's more self-taught. Growing up, I was just very independent. My parents got divorced when I was 9 or 10. And we lived with my mom, and she worked in the evenings. She was a dance instructor and things like that. So there was a lot of kind of teaching moments that I just had to kind of figure things out on my own. Yeah. And I found myself having a paper route, working as a in a dish room, doing multiple things, always just kind of keeping myself busy, moving forward, trying to grow, trying to, go on and not taking no for an answer in some ways. The paper route was a very unique thing because we had to sell our subscription. So we had to go door to door, so here I am.
It is very healthy to learn at a young age, some sell techniques.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it serves you well as you get older and move into big world stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So as a 12-year-old, I was like, knocking on doors, and people were like, "No, we don't need, we don't need that." And then you just go to the next one, and eventually somebody says yes, and you learn from that as well.
So when you're building your company and you're noticing like what's available on the market to people that are interested in architecture, was there a philosophy or an approach that you wanted integrated into your uniqueness? Was because I mean, you and I have talked about laser scanning, but we also talked about building information modeling. Was that something that you saw as like a differentiator when you started Dauntless?
Definitely when I started, I saw it as a differentiator, because I was, from 2009, I was, the firm I worked for was an AutoCAD environment, but they were starting to get into Revit, and I ended up self-teaching myself Revit, because in the office they would only do the training if you were working on a specific project, but they told me I wanted to learn it, and they're like, well, we have a license, there's tutorials there, you can teach yourself. So I started actually doing that in that office, but then when I got out, I had to make a decision quickly, and so I ended up making a decision about Revit, and kind of full steam ahead with that. But I used to, I would be very like, I'm doing it in 3D. I'm, everything is connected. There's going to be less, any of those benefits you could think of from if you're trying to buy, Autodesk is selling you Revit. I'm kind of using those as a way to kind of sell my services at the same time. And and I would basically tell people, I'm like, yeah, I'm completely different than what you're used to. I mean, again, talking about 2009.
We're still at a space where I'm trying to explain what building information modeling is, differentiating between, I'm using Revit, but Revit doesn't default to being building information modeling. It's like we're slowly evolving what the deliverable is in architecture and design. So it's not always easy to get your clients to understand that differentiator, but it is significant, and it takes a different mindset to get into it. At what point did you discover like the power of laser scanning and how it fit into the Revit platform?
It was a few years ago. I think like a lot of it's, even when like VIM's first introduced, you start seeing articles, whether it's in our industry and whatnot. And I really saw laser scanning as a way to I feel it's a more accurate way to capture existing conditions. Agreed. Yeah. I kind of have to laugh when people are like, because the camera, those companies, they have to provide like what the level of accuracy is. And they say, within 1% accuracy or something. And when people kind of resist it because they're like, well, it's 1%. I'm like, yeah, but when you're out there with a clipboard, you're probably 10%, off, it's like,
it's what did I want to round to that day?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, well, and everybody has that experience when they were measuring, with a clipboard and a tape measure, where you take all the pictures, you take all the measurements, you go back, you start drawing up whatever you surveyed, and you miss that corner or you miss that point. There's always, everybody has that experience. I don't know anybody who has never had that experience. Well,
yeah, because humans are imperfect, so therefore we have imperfect data.
Yes. Yeah. So the, with the laser scanning, I saw it as a really neat thing, but then of course you see the price of this equipment. So that's a little bit, I pulled the trigger a little bit later than I probably would have liked, because I'm like, well, I don't have $50,000 or anything like that. But I will say, I forget when, maybe it was 3 years ago when the Leica BLK 360 was introduced. And I mean, still that's a $20,000 product, but I was like, oh, this is a game changer. Now we're talking where things are like starting to get that price point, like TV, flat screen TVs used to be thousands of dollars, and now you can get one for a couple $100, so right. I just was like, okay, now we're talking. So
now we're winning and we're cooking with gas.
Yes. Yeah. So I ended up I was trying to get the BLK. It didn't work out financing wise or whatever. So I did end up pulling the trigger on a Matterport camera, and I would prefer to have the BLK, but it got me into the space, actually scanning. Yeah.
Honestly, when you're getting into documenting a structure, half the battle is trying to capture all of the interactions.
Yeah.
Ceiling, structure, walls, finish. And so having that image to refer back to, and the level of detail is pretty solid on the Matterport. I mean, the exterior, not the light issue that Matterport has with capturing an exterior is a little limiting. But definitely, especially given, quarantine circumstances, those Matterport deliverables are very powerful. Oh, yeah.
I mean, we can, actually just in recent months, myself and, Mike, who you and I have had a conversation with, who I believe will be a guest at some point.
Yeah. We'll get him on.
We both work together, and he does more of, the Leica products and that, but both of us got an opportunity to scan the Shapiro House by Louis Kahn over in Philadelphia.
That's super exciting.
Yeah. So he was doing the exterior. I was doing the interior with the Matterport, and we were able to put stuff together. And it was for a documentation package for another architect who had actually worked on a different Louis Kahn house in Philadelphia. So from that experience, somebody was buying the Shapiro house. It was the first time the Shapiro family actually sold the house. So this other architect was known to already work on Louis Kahn houses. So he got hired. But he hired us then to, do the scanning and capture all the existing data. I mean, we had all kinds of drawings, but it's still, you need to have that, go out and take your measurements, however you're going to take them. As architects, we have to do that legally. So,
yeah.
So we did that, and we're able to, I was happy to be involved with that job. But that's one of those things that happened with me with getting the Matterport. Like, I got the Matterport to just scan my own projects, And I was looking at it more of a way of like, I wanted to get into space. I thought the laser scanning was interesting, but it also, then I didn't have to have that second person. I was hiring like a high school kid to help me for a day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you have two humans that are deciding what they're going to round to. And
yeah. And monetarily, it was like, it was easier, it was much easier for me to pay a high school kid $15 an hour or whatever it was than, another architect to come help me,
I had that thought today. I'm like, well, I don't have to pay a software overtime, and I can't overwork the software.
Yeah.
So that's a plus to technology adoption.
Yeah. And I also think back to one of the last times I actually had a high school kid help me do a survey by hand. We had lunch afterwards, because I always make sure to get it. You feed to help and all that stuff. But there ended up being an earthquake.
Get out of here.
When we're having lunch in New Jersey.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm sitting in a restaurant, and the ducks are going and everything. And, a little aside to that, the same week my daughter was born, so this is actually 8 years ago or whatever, but she was born in a hurricane. So we had a hurricane and an earthquake all in the same week. So that
cannot control Mother Nature.
Yeah. So, but I always think back to that. I was like, oh yeah, I want to get this laser scanner, because I don't want to have people have earthquakes again.
I mean, consistency is important. And I would say that from what I'm hearing, you were able to build a network of others that supported you in your adoption and reinforced the processes. Like, is there a resource? Have you found any ways to kind of fast track workflows when you're trying to take on a new technology, new software?
Yes, I mean, obviously the scanning in that already, quickly makes things go. But then now let's go to the documentation side. There's a whole new problem, because you're drawing from a different way. So it's really, I mean, I go back to like the, self-taught, like how I learned Revit. It, went to the tutorials, whether they were in the software themselves, or, Google, internet, all that stuff. So I, looked into a number of, things. I'm like, well, what's the proper way to convert a point cloud to be usable in Revit and all this stuff? And, some of it's just tinkering. Actually, one of the things Mike and I had found with the point cloud, once you have it in Revit, is the color settings on the point cloud itself.
Yeah.
Because it defaults to the RGB. So it looks like, as if it was pictures. But we found one of the settings, I think it was normals, makes like kind of really, it's like kind of a purple green. It's still kind of RGB, but it's a different like kind of spectrum of colors.
Yeah.
But it focuses on edges.
Right. So you see everything clearer when you're setting up when you're matching. I call it a template,
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it was really
is
great.
important.
Yeah. And it was really just me clicking on every different color, because we had a project we did together where we had a basement where the lighting wasn't that good. And I have flashlights and things like that, but it was just in certain corners or whatever where the lights weren't quite reaching. We couldn't tell what it was. So I just kept on clicking on each little setting. And then all of a sudden I'm like, what's this one? Oh, this is perfect. So now we use it, and it's funny because every once in a while on both of our social medias, we'll share like, oh, the normal setting, it came back and did its job again, and all of that. So, I wouldn't say it's like a quick, like, I got to wake up and here's that advice. It's more like you got to mess with your toys a little bit and kind of get under the hood to figure it out.
That was a huge point when I was first learning Revit. There was there's stages where things kind of unlocked for me, and one of them was taking SPOSTA off the table. If you watch The Simpsons, someone's got a case of the SPOSTAs.
Okay.
And I would get into this software, and I had it in my head, like psychologically, like I'm supposed to know this. I should know how this is. And then one day I'm like, you know what? This is all weird. So you gotta you just gotta roll with it and stop setting your expectations that you should know this. And I felt like that kind of unlocked my ability to find the answers that I needed to look for. And the school of YouTube and Google are just priceless. Because you can see how different people are doing different things. When you got like 100 ways to build a wall in Revit, there's also 100 ways to set up your laser scan, methods, targets, all of those things. And honestly, it's about finding a great workflow for you, but also kind of trying to find where people are posting information that, they've broken through a few of those barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely and then you find as you keep on doing that, then you start kind of filtering out some of the things you thought were great at first, and then you're like, wait, no, that's bad advice.
Don't do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of endeavors that I kind of went down, and then you get to the far side of your deliverable, and you're like, nope, don't do it that way, because the cascading consequences are challenging. And I can imagine when you're first trying to learn, a new software, the software like Revit was relatively new when you were starting to adopt and train. So, I mean, you've had to evolve with the software, I can imagine, because I started working in it in 2016. The 2016 version is very different than the 2020 version. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, like, when I was mentioning earlier, when I first was started working with that security consultant, they are my first client, and I say are because they still are a client of mine. But it started off as just AutoCAD work, but then eventually they were like, "Hey, we got this job, we got to do it in Revit. Can you help us?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And the experience with a huge $1 billion casino job or casino renovation job, still big. And big firm names there that came in was a great experience, because we're dealing with projects where you have an architecture model, but there may be 5 or 6 architecture models, because it's like a casino building is many buildings in one. So you have an interior design model for a restaurant space. You have a separate one for just the casino floor. You have another one for the shell of the building. And then you talk about all the different trades, the structural model, the mechanical model, the electrical model, et cetera. So you have all of these different models. And one thing that really surprised me was like you have these big firms and no standards, really.
Yeah.
Or they would be like the biggest thing would be like, oh, well, so how do I insert your model into my model and start working? And there was no, in the early days, there was zero direction. It was like, oh, insert by origin point or whatever, and then you're good. I'm like, no, that doesn't work. So you would always have like, okay, I said 15 models, right? So the architecture model always comes in right. You do when they started having some directions, but then you'd always have that one model that comes in and it's 700 feet, over on the side. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
So there was, a big lack of standards. And even to this day, it surprises me sometimes when I work on some of those bigger jobs where, the standards aren't really there or the way they had the standards set up. I'm like, I've had conversations with my security consultant client where I'm like, their standards are wrong. The way you insert the models, they're not, and I'm not trying to get into the little nitpicky
Well, I know,
parts,
but that's like when you're trying to break through and you try and get into what I call single source BIM and a federated model. The best practices of each of those individual companies that are pulling those designs in matters. And at the time when this was all first getting adopted, I felt like there was a lot of protectionism about your files. You wouldn't want to share your Revit file with another firm because it felt like you were just giving away your IP.
Yep.
So it's really exciting, I think, to see how they're creating an environment where those models can come together, but it isn't uncomfortable to push that data into one place.
Yeah, and actually it's because if you talk about like a BIM 360 product and all of that, where the really interesting thing I found with BIM 360 was, and this will go outside of our industry a little bit, but like I had a hard time understanding what Bitcoin was. And
Alex and Lance could talk about Bitcoin.
But the technology behind the blockchain technology about it. So I started looking up like, well, how does blockchain solve? And then, if you think contractually, like all the access, everybody has access to the information. I'm like, that's how BIM 360 set up. I'm like, I've been working in the blockchain technology for years now.
We're already done. Did it.
Yeah. I was like, okay, I get it. Now I get it. There's the confusing part with Bitcoin and the mining and all that stuff. But the blockchain technology, I was like, oh, I'm already working in that there. So, if a technology like that becomes a little bit more, let's just say acceptable in the general public, I think, the collaborative aspect of what we're talking about in this, the digital design and, cloud-based stuff and all that stuff is probably going to become more acceptable as well.
Yeah. Well, and it does come down to like, how the softwares are being marketed, but also the support that's behind them. I found that that's one of my distinguishers prior to buying a subscription or buying a new piece of hardware is what's the support behind it, and making sure that there's people in process to enlighten you as the best way to use it. Like I can create a laser scan, but I want to make sure that laser scan data is usable to a broad spectrum. And so knowing the full scope of the project before you get into like the either modeling or scanning is so significant. And the downstream value is so profound that it's really inspiring adoption much faster. But having the people and having the support in place to bounce those ideas and, do like a little gut check, make sure you're doing things well is very important, I've found.
Yeah, no, it's like the idea of having like a mentor or something. It's like, if you have somebody who can kind of guide you, it's going to be more beneficial than if you're kind of thrown out there figuring it out on your own.
So you found mentors in regards to like your professional development? In regards to building your company, did you have an informal board of advisors or mentors that kind of helped you create the Dauntless concept?
My wife is probably
sounding board.
Yeah. Well, my wife, she actually has her own business as well. She's had a dance school since like 2004, so she's, kind of lived through the business owner experiences and things like that. So that's been like my big sounding board. I realized, like, looking back into, the history, like before our call, I was trying to think, I was like, well, the idea of a mentor is probably going to come up. And like, I realized a lot of people that I had, prior to having my own business, they're more, more like employees. Mm-hmm. They weren't necessarily entrepreneurs. Obviously I have mentors in that environment in terms of who taught me how to, like, here's what you do on a construction site. Here's the things you do when you're drawing casework elevation, whatever it may be in that case. But entrepreneur, why I think now though, it's like, cause I've done like a lot of business networking and that, and I would say the colleagues that I've gotten, not in my industry, but the guy who owns the payroll company, the guy who has the print shop, people like that who I stay in contact with or in networking groups with have become more of, I consider them colleagues, but they're also can be mentors.
Did you find them through like a chamber of commerce, or was it just in the course of developing your own business and having to like work with other companies to get?
I would say it's more the chamber of commerce route. Mm-hmm. I've done like the BNIs of the world and, different things like that. I've actually, these days, I'm more of like these kind of, I'm gonna call them grassroots, but like local networking organizations. I haven't had a lot of success with the chambers, and a lot of the chambers I've found in my experience have been more like private clubs. And like, if you're not in that club, it's just like, I remember my town's chamber of commerce, I presented about, I think it was like, land use approvals or zoning drawing approvals at like a lunch and learn. And it was me and a lawyer. So I presented with this lawyer, and then I go a few months later to another event, and that same lawyer comes up to me and introduces himself like he never met me. And I'm like, we did a presentation together, buddy. I
was standing next to you for 20 minutes.
Yeah. I was like, but these other couple of local networking groups that I've gotten involved with have been, the one I'm in is kind of like a good party.
Sometimes you need that to keep you going. I mean, nothing about building a business is easy. And I say, you need to keep the enthusiasm going. Mm-hmm. So knowing where you can find the infusion of energy when you're just kind of lagging has been very, very powerful on my side. Yeah, no. And I like to actually socialize with people not in our field, to be quite honest. I agree.
Yeah. I would have, some people are like, oh, do you have any architecture friends? And I'm like, I got guys and girls I went to school with and things like that. But I enjoy, spice. What is it? The
spice of life.
The spice of life, or variety of life.
Variety is
the spice of life. That's
there.
I believe is yeah. So I like to have different types of people to bounce ideas off of, or just simply socialize with, to be quite honest.
That is true. All right, so let's get into the 30 no's.
Okay.
Because you've built a company, you were in an existing company, it was very big, and then you were in the early part of going into building information modeling. What's the best no you've heard? Was it right? Was it wrong? Tell me about it.
Yeah, so my no is actually a yes. And
okay.
So earlier, when I was describing the beginning of my company, was working on this, $2.5 billion casino project. So fast forward to, I think, maybe the end of 2015. So what's that about? So I'm about 6 years in, right? Mm-hmm. I get a call from an architect down in Atlantic City, And I had done some support for that company in the recent years right there. And they worked on this casino project as well. And like I was helping them do some existing condition surveys, drawing up some stuff for them, things like that. Because that is about 50% of my business. But let me just stay on topic here. So they call me up and they go, "Hey, we have a perfect client for you." I'm like, "Okay." And they were like, "You remember the casino?" You know, like, yeah, obviously. They're like, "Well, do you know so-and-so?" And it was this guy who was, so the casino company had claimed, filed for bankruptcy. And then, they sold the building to this developer, and a very interesting guy. But, so they say, "Do you know him?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I've heard about him in the news." They're like, "Well, he would like to meet you." And I was like, "Okay, great. What for?" And he's like, "Well, he's looking for an architect."
Context. Honestly, like you say, like someone says to me, "I have the perfect client for you." That's a huge red flag that it's probably the opposite of perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and you have somebody who you can look up on the news and find, and this guy, there's dirt on this guy in the news, for different things. So I'm like, okay, he's like, "Well, we're going to give you the number. We're going to give your number to him and he's going to give you a call." And I'm like, "Well, hold on." I'm like, "He's looking for an architect. Why aren't you doing it?" And he's like, and they said something like, "Oh, we're too busy," or something like this. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, "Okay. All right." So, I hang up the phone and literally like 2 minutes later, I get this call he's from Florida. So it was like I'm not sure what the Florida area code is, but it was a number from, it said like, whatever city, Florida.
Okay.
And I was like, okay. So I pick up the phone and it's him. And this was a Friday. I'm actually in the middle of a deadline. And he goes, "Well, I'd like to meet you." I'm like, "Okay. When would you like to meet?" He's like, "Can you come down tonight?" I'm like, "Well, I'm in the middle of a deadline." I'm like, "I'll probably be done about 5 or 6. He's like, "Come on down right after that." I was like, "Okay." So I go down, I meet with the guy, go to the building, and when I got laid off from that other firm, I have a theory that there was some office politics, and I actually heard stories later on, like I got laid off, but then got blamed for things that weren't actually true.
Oh, the dark underworld of firms. Okay.
Yeah. So I always had like a little bit of like, I was like, oh, I was like upset that I got laid off. Right.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, here's my opportunity to kind of stick it to my old firm. I'm like, I'm the one who, becomes the architect or whatever for this new guy and whatever the new version of this building is going to be. Cause there was it's a huge building. There was, I think I figured it out. There was close to 1 million square feet that was never built in the building.
Oh my goodness.
That still needed, whether retail spaces that never got filled in or just, there was areas
at the edge of my seat. I need to know what happened.
Yeah. So I go, met with him. We go, he takes me out for dinner that night at a nice, restaurant in Atlantic City.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically have a handshake agreement that I got hired,
Nice.
And then so the following Monday or Tuesday, I got a call and he goes, "Can you come down?" I'm like, "Yeah, I can come down. When do you want me to come down?" "Oh, I want you to come down now." And I was like, okay, it was like the first thing I wanted to do. So it ended up, this was very similar. My experience with him was he would call me up on a day. He had an idea for some space in the building,
mm-hmm.
and I would walk around with him. We'd kick around the ideas, and these varied from a bowling alley to movie theaters to different retail spaces, a water park, go-kart tracks, a gun range. All kinds of different ideas. And then he was even in the news.
This guy has. Okay.
Yeah. Well, he had I can tell you afterwards the guy's name, and you could look it up. But he had a whole thing. Yeah, there was 2,000 room hotel tower as part of this hotel.
Yeah.
Building was, and actually the base of the building was built to have a second tower too. So the potential to build a second 200 room tower. He was talking about building it and making it a tower for geniuses. Was literally his quote. Yeah.
All right. So how did the no be a yes?
You mean the yes be a no?
How did the yes be a no?
Yeah. So the no came because, let's fast forward 1.5 years later, because I had those experiences and I hardly did a drawing.
Okay.
But the guy was paying. So then he stopped. He started complaining a little bit because I was I was charging by the hour. That was our agreement. But then he stopped. He started shorting me payments. And then I was like, okay, I'm out. I'm done. I'm done with this. So a few years later, maybe a year or so later, one of that architecture firm who called me up, one of their, I think he was either a senior associate or a principal. He was all of a sudden, he wasn't part of the firm anymore. I forget how I found out, but I call him up and I was like, hey, do you want to have lunch? And he's like, yeah, sure. So, and we had talked and there was different parts of the conversation, but the one I eventually asked, I was like, hey, why did you guys pass up on that project? And he was like, oh, we didn't want to deal with that guy. And we just figured you were the type, we could just, you'd be excited to work on it with the history in the building and all that different stuff. And I was like, yeah. But then now that I look back, the reason why I consider it a no for me, and something that I learned from, was I went into that with those bad feelings I had for my previous job.
Right. You had a gut instinct.
Yeah. I wanted to stick it to them and show them that I can do it and all that stuff. And I was like, did I make money? Yes. And all that stuff, but it probably didn't really help me. Like even though I did hire 2 people, it was the first time I had 2 employees, got an office.
There was some development around that, having that client that was positive.
Yeah. But I also feel that I kind of stayed at a same level for a while. Like I really wasn't growing, because after that project was done, the money wasn't there, and the employees went away, and I was back to myself. And then I also had an 800 square foot office to myself that I have a 3-year lease on.
Yeah. And I've heard in the professional space that you often make more on the no's that you give than the yeses. Being able to read a client or the environment or the project group. And I've run into this myself. It's, you do have a gut and you say, well, is this going to further my professional abilities, or is this going to kind of stifle my development?
Yeah.
And it's a good metric to have in place. And it sounds like you were able to kind of reflect on that. And were you able to kind of use those principles moving forward?
Yeah. Well, it's like one of these things, like that call, there was red flags all over the place. Yeah. Like, I mean, you were picking it up just from me telling the story. Yeah. And I'm going into it like, I'm like, I probably shouldn't be doing it, like I shouldn't go forward, but it's like, it's really like, and that's something that I could always tell somebody if they wanted to start. I'm like, always trust your gut. I'm like, 99% of the time your gut is right. If you don't think this is right, heck, I had a conversation before our call today with somebody where it was like, why did I take this project? It's not, I mean, I'm going to make a little bit, I'm making a profit, but I'm like, it's not, it's like one of those things where it's like, I have 4 other projects I need to be working on that are get me fired up. This project is a foundation designed for a prefab home. It's going to pay the bills a little bit, but it's not like I don't feel like I'm moving forward.
I do have I have a little mantra that I kind of use when I'm in those deciphering moments. That's, am I adding value or am I adding noise? And I use that, well, I mean, even in regards to social media posts, it's a good baseline to say, like, am I adding value? And the same thing with like the role that you'll take in a project. Am I adding value or am I adding noise? And it doesn't do you professionally any good if you're the noise.
Right.
And to know where your value is a profound, like, benchmark to reach, is knowing what your value is and how you can add value to each of your endeavors. It's a good filter.
Yeah. And, in the example I was just giving in my call earlier today was like, I found myself, I was still in selling mode when I'm actually, it's the permit drawing. Like, I'm describing why I put 8-inch CMU the whole way up to the underside of the floor, like, and I'm like, well, code requires this, and this. And I'm like, oh, I'm still selling to this guy. Yeah. Where it's like, oh yeah, that's not, it just backs up the gut feeling again.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, I think because you have such longevity in the industry, and you spoke about how you like to diversify your social endeavors and not necessarily hang out with folks in the industry.
Yeah.
We have listeners that are outside design and construction space. If you had to share like some key points in regards to what they should know before they go into a design or construction process, what would that be?
It's probably going to take longer than you think. That's probably number one.
What is the role of an architect is always something that I'm trying to like leapfrog, because I do find that there's architects that focus very much on the artistic side of the space, and then there's others that are more focused on the technical, and then an owner trying to hire, like, how do you pick which one you need?
Yeah. And I have actually an owner who picked both once. Like they hired a different architect to do design, and then he hired me to do the permit drawings.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, no, it's the well, it's interesting when you mention like the design and the technical, because there's also the builder part of the equation, and I always feel like my experience that the builder always thinks that we just know design. We don't know any of the technical.
Oh yeah, we've gotten to put the lines on paper.
Yeah,
which is why I do love building information modeling, because it does force you to think about all that.
Yeah, and that's my big selling point when it comes to BIM is I'm like, well, everything's in 3D. I remember back in 2010, maybe one of my first bigger projects. It was a 4-unit condo building, historic renovation of a building in Center City, Philadelphia, where we were cutting a hole through the roof and doing a roof deck, and then so we had a sloped roof. I remember having the conversation with the builder, because there was a flat deck, and then the sloped roof, and then there was another sloped beam. I forget why. I'm trying to remember why there was a kind of a third, like a second layer of slopeness. That's the technical term, but I remember being out there where I was like, no, that beam's sloped, and the builder's like, why would that beam be sloped? And I'm like, I modeled it. Like I knew it in the model, you know. And I was having this conversation where I was 100% confident in what I was saying was correct. Now 2010, BIM 360 and everybody with iPads, stuff like that. That wasn't quite happening yet.
Right.
But yeah, it was a big thing for me where I was like, oh no, it's a huge benefit for me because I see it beforehand. And, or if there's a question that comes up, you cut a quick section or something like that. You have if you model everything correctly to how it needs to be built, then you're so far ahead of the game.
Well, and I think it is great now where we are in the building information modeling space is that you have an opportunity to have those conversations with the builder ahead of field construction.
Yes.
So you don't necessarily have to be standing in the field deciphering those pitches and interactions.
Yeah. I mean, heck, I even have a builder who hires me sometimes for projects where he leads to the homeowner. He goes, oh yeah, my architect, he has this really cool camera and he captures everything, so we're not going to miss anything. And then he has everything in 3D. He'll show you some really cool pictures so you can really understand the design. So it's like, now even builders are kind of selling those services. Well,
and honestly, that's where I thought building information really took off, is that, if it was positioned to the design space, it's not always the most friendly to get your ideas out, because there are restrictions and constraints when you're just trying to conceptualize the space. But then when you're getting to the actual documentation, when builders and owners see the downstream benefits of it, I do think the adoption has picked up because of that inclusion. And, your company is design collaborative.
To add to that point, I had noticed that I looked at my numbers and that 50% of my business is actually more BIM consulting. And that's been doing work for contractors, other designers, just BIM support on, I do work for an interior designer who does large senior living facilities, so they hardly touch Revit. I'm doing it for them,
Yeah. If
and
the tool's
on
in the hands that, there's lots of different ways to do it, but if the tool's there, let's use it.
Yeah. And I have, on the contractor side, I have found that, I'm clicking on the structure. I have Revit open right in front of me, so I'm just reading them off. But structure, steel, well, not necessarily precast, but systems. Those tabs that aren't necessarily architecture. I've dived into those too, because some contractors, electrical contractor calls me up. I got a lab building on the University of Pennsylvania's campus. It's going to be multiple phases, multiple floors. The building's still going to be open, all this different stuff. We have to coordinate it and do all the conduit runs. Can you help me and model our conduit and equipment? I'm like, yes.
Yes.
Did I know how to do all of that stuff when I said yes? Not necessarily.
No, but it's important, I would say, to have those triggers that get you going.
Yeah. And no, I loved that job. I loved going down to the job site. It was a bigger job. It was more complicated. It was, previous life as an employee, going to job sites, talking as an architect. But now I'm on the contractor only meetings.
I honestly have that experience as well. I can be in the office and I can be like knee deep in modeling, and then sometimes my brain just melts down and I call up any of the active construction sites and I'm like, I gotta come down. I gotta get in the dirt. I gotta feel this.
Yeah. But it's also seeing how the contractors, construction management companies, how they're using the model. So as only an architect before, like you'd hear, like I'm thinking of like sitting in a meeting with engineers. Mm-hmm. And they're like complaining about CAD backgrounds or something. And you're like, what do you mean? It's fine. Well, we're fine how we work. But when you go into the other side of the table and then you receive that architect's model or the architect's drawings or whatever, and then you start understanding that, it's like, it's going to help you in your own work,
Yeah.
Because, go back to the collaborative aspect of it. It's like you're kind of seeing all sides, so you can help everybody.
Well, there's small, like tiny small things that make a huge impact when you're in field construction. I had a very awkward building layout, and the only way I could get it to fit on sheets is if I had it at 3/8 scale. Oh. And for permitting, it's fine, but for active construction, my builder's like, no.
Right.
I got to be able to pull out my tape. I want to be able to scale things. So that was two very important pieces of information. One, setting the scales on your sheets does have a direct impact on work efficiency. And two, how many dimension strings are you able to drop in your model so that if they're working off of paper plans, they don't have to pull out their tape.
Right.
It's not hard to drop a dimension, but sometimes, you don't want to make your drawings too cluttered or, you're disinclined, but when it does help. And seeing the little things that I could do while I'm in my model and getting things developed for the builder. I mean, it's a really nice and it's an important step to take, is getting yourself out there and knowing how people are using the documents you're creating for them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like because you model it doesn't mean you necessarily communicated it properly to all the parties. You have to have those other steps and understanding how they communicate or how they read things.
Yeah. And the more we're in the model, the more assumptions end up on my sheet.
Yeah.
It's like I get so comfortable in the building, in my virtual experiences that, sometimes you forget that they've never seen it, and you're handing over these documents and they're trying to, and that's why I really do appreciate having those project meetings that are, virtual experiences, not just for owners, but for the builders, so that you can have that exchange ahead of field construction.
Yeah. And I always found myself lucky. I'm 45 years old. So I come from a time where like AutoCAD was just starting to take off when I was in high school. Like I took like AutoCAD version 2 or 3, I believe, with my senior year in high school, was a drafting class. So there was still a lot of the, I'm going to call it old school, hand drafters still, like even in the offices when I first got out of school. And I was taught a lot of different things of like, okay, when you're setting up a drawing sheet, and, when you mentioned dimension strings is like the big thing. Like I had a project architect I worked under who was very particular about, you really only have 3 exterior strings, overall volume, individual items, and and you go from there. And he explained, all those different steps for that. And so I still use those to this day, because I'm always like, well, yeah, there's always going to be, and you always run into it. It's like, yeah, you had mentioned, like, there's still contractors who work in paper. So you have to document for that, but then you also have to document for the other side of it, for the fully virtual person, who may be working out there with an iPad or something. So
yes, and being able to straddle both of those, I would say, is an important skill, and also maybe a unique differentiator in when you're starting a company. It's like, how are you straddling those different workflows? Yeah,
and that's actually the big selling point I do to this day. Like when you asked me earlier about a differentiator, so we talked about BIM and 3D modeling. Now I go the other way. I go, well, I have the experience of, like, the old school methods.
Analog.
Yeah. I can do analog and digital, so that's like one of the things when we were mentioning earlier, when I was talking back to you and Alex, from that episode, those were things that I was kind of like saying to myself, really.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you can't go 100% digital, and that, as you get more and more people who are coming up who may have been raised on only digital, there's a huge differentiator right there. They haven't experienced that, because that's not, this, I don't think we won't have to get into talk about architecture schools, but that's not really a point that the schools are pushing.
Well, I mean, that leads to an important question. I mean, what advice would you give to a graduate or a younger person that's like looking to get into the industry, is compelled by the digitization of construction? What would your advice be?
First would be to step away from the screen and understand that it's a business of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that you have to work with others. You could have this great idea, but you have to be able to work with others in order to get that great idea built. You can't do it alone.
Right.
So it's, and that's key. I mean, I've worked some of these bigger jobs that I did work on as an employee. We were working with architects,
Mm-hmm.
so I had seen some of those attitudes where it was like, well, that's, doesn't really, it created problems, didn't solve problems. I mean, it's a great looking building at the end, but the process, in my opinion, was a little slowed down by some egos, let's just say.
Does happen. We're humans.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We definitely are. So, but yeah, that's a very key, is to understanding that, you need to have those relationships in order to move forward with a project.
Where do you find like educational pathways that can, be productive? I've talked to young people that have gotten into architectural programs as undergrads. There's others that have waited. They've done something else at undergrad, then waited to do the architectural pathway post. Do you have like looking back, is there a way to have like fast-tracked or streamlined the entrance into the industry?
I think probably, understanding construction and actually having to build something is very important. I'm not like a contractor in any way, but, I did, just working on your own home can be very helpful. I remember actually going back to when I was a student, we had a professor of ours who was redeveloping his own projects. So a bunch of us would sometimes he'd hire some of us for like an entire summer to help on some of the projects. And I ended up becoming like a day laborer one day for him on a project, but he wanted to kind of teach us something at the same time. So me and my one buddy, he was like, look, we have it was a window off of like a back deck. And he was like, design me something cool, I think is what he said. So we had this whole idea where the window pops out, rotates down on a track and becomes a table out on the deck.
Ooh.
He's like, oh, but you have to build it in a day. So
He's teaching you a little bit about like construction production rates.
Yeah. So you know what we ended up doing was we ended up just being like, you know what, we're just going to keep this window and we're just going to fill it in with the spray foam. That's like what we accomplished that day. And I learned about spray foam that day too. It's like, you don't fill it with the foam because it expands. That whole thing. So I spent half the day, shaving the the spray foam off of the window. But that experience was great because it was like, I was going into, I believe, my last year of school, and I had done well in studio and all that different stuff, and thought I knew everything about architecture because I was a 22-year-old guy, and kind of smacked down a little bit, like, no, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. If you draw something up, it just doesn't get built. You gotta figure things out and take some time. So.
It is. If you had to, someone totally outside the industry that doesn't understand how digital is really kind of getting implemented into construction, what is something you would say to those folks about digital and how, where collaboration meets? What are your thoughts?
One of the first things is it doesn't make a job more expensive.
Yes, I totally agree.
Yeah, it actually saves you money. Just because it looks fancy doesn't make it more. I mean, the whole idea of laser scanning, I mean, that's a big selling point that I put out there now, is that I'm like, look, I'm actually doing an entire, survey of a house or building in much less time than if it was a crew of 2 or 3 people. And then, I could break it down by, hours. I'm in and out. I did a house in like less than 2 hours, and it was just me. If you took my hourly rate, sure, I'm more than, the high school student or college student or intern or whatever. But, I could break it down where it's like, here's proof in the pudding that this is half the price.
Right. So not only are you saving time in the actual documenting process, but when you're in your modeling software, your ability to model quicker is also a value add.
Yeah, I tell people, I used to not tell people this, but now when I'm like, in a meeting with a potential client, I proudly am like, oh, I'm a one-person firm, and here's why. I work in this software and it saves me so much time. The coordination of drawing, I don't jump into all the nitty gritty little stuff about it. But
you're better than I do. I want everyone to know how the views all pop, bidirectional associativity, like all the things.
Oh, well, I've realized over the years that most people don't care a little bit about that. So I'm like, why am I like, you can see the eyes gloss over, and I kind of use that approach. But no, I use that as a selling point, and I'm just like, because that's the other thing is I can come up with a price sometimes, and it might be like I might be the like lowest fee. So people are like, well, why are you the lowest fee? And I can kind of back it up of like how I came across that fee, and some of it is like, I don't have the overhead, I don't have that 800 square foot office anymore. But you can, I would say production is a huge differentiator. However, you are offering, like don't devalue yourself either. Like it's trying to find a healthy balance between, one should be compensated more for leveraging different approaches and technologies, not less if it's, solely based on our production rates. But it is a difficult play. So if I'm working with a client, often I hear, or when I first started going down the digital construction pathway, one of the big ones I heard was, that's overkill. You don't need that. Not on this size of project. Do you have a response to that feedback? Well, like I think of like, when somebody sees a 3D model, they see it as there's more work. I'm like, no, again, it goes back to, I'm like, no, it's less work. It's just like when I draw a line, it's a wall, and that wall has a height. So it just makes it in 3D. So, and then here's 4 different views, right? Here's your elevation. Here's your section. I'm like, I draw the wall, and then I add the door, it's included in all those 3 or 4 views automatically. So now, but before I had to do it 3 more times, So right there, I'm like, I did all of that in 25% less time, in theory, that, and that's been a way for people to understand like that. And then of course, just the benefit of the 3D, I've had an easier way of showing, because some people can't read floor plans.
Do you know, I think 97% of people cannot read floor plans.
Yeah.
You're an outlier if you can.
Uh-huh.
So you're like part of 3%.
Uh-huh.
Well, like it creates a new inclusion in your design process. It's got to be easier to convey your aesthetic or your, concept.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, it's just so much easier to sell that. And then if you come up, like, here's a great example. I have a recent project, a current project that I have where it's do you know what a Trinity is? Like a row home. So it's an urban. I mean, row homes are pretty common.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
I don't think that's on the East Coast thing. But a Trinity, I don't know if it's it's a type of row home just for Philadelphia.
Okay.
But it is tiny. It is let's just call it a tiny home row home.
Okay.
And I'm not, usually it's 3 floors. Maybe that's why it's called a Trinity. But I have a client, they live in a Trinity. So it's the base, what's the footprint of the house? It's like 15 feet wide by maybe 30 feet deep.
Okay.
Yeah. And in the 30 feet deep on the first, and that's the first floor. You have living room, dining room, kitchen, all within that 30 feet. And then when you go upstairs, it's only 18 feet deep total. Like basically there's a room on the second floor and a room on the third floor, so real small. So it's a growing, younger couple. They just had their baby's like 10 months old or something. So they want to have an addition. So basically whatever that space is, on the second and third floor from the footprint on the first floor, they want to build an addition, add a bedroom, make their bedrooms on the third floor. They want to have a master suite type thing. So looking at the zoning and all of this, I think the kitchen actually is an illegal, to the current codes, is an illegal,
right.
Per the setbacks and everything, because literally they have a 1 foot rear yard, and not even that, because they have a bay window that comes in. Like I have a picture. There's a fence. It's like literally like their bay window in 6 inches, and then there's a fence. So.
Yeah, it's going to be challenging to build today's code in those constraints.
Yeah. So, but the wall between the kitchen and the dining room is perfect for like, can we build the new addition right on that? Because there's a foundation and everything. But it ends up that there's another 2 feet you could gain if you go towards the back past that wall. So I wanted to show these clients like, here's the layout that you want, but I also wanted to let them know that but that bearing wall that's below structurally is about 2 feet inboard of that. So if you want to maximize your size of your house, of your addition, you're going to not be off there. So there's other things we have to kind of consider structurally for this. But if we moved it back 2 feet when we're right on there, then it's, we're just kind of stacking right on top. It's, it's going to be a little bit easier. So I show them plan with a little dotted walls, and they're like, okay, we saw that. But then it was like, they really kind of clicked when I had like a 3D section cut through, and they could see the walls where they lined up from each other. Right. So it's very, the 3D aspect of it was so helpful, and they got it right away.
Right away. Yeah. I mean, I got it. The design cycles just seem to happen way faster.
Yeah.
So we're going to wind up. I did want to get some ideas from you. Where do you see digital going? Because I do feel like with this collaborative and integrated platforms that the possibilities of construction are more expansive. Do you have any that you kind of geek out to?
Yeah, I actually, when you talk about virtual reality, I'm not too excited about that.
Okay.
I'm I see there's the use in that, but I'm more excited about augmented reality.
Right.
I think there's, there's just a lot more possibilities with that. I'm just imagining, the ability for you to stand on like an empty site, let's say you have like a school building or something, and you stand there and you have like, all the data points are kind of synced with each other, that you could sit there with the device, stand in the actual field of where something's going to be built, and then bring that up in some way, whether, maybe it is a virtual reality type thing, but I just see it as like, you're holding an iPad. I've seen examples of that,
Right.
where you move around and you could actually sit there and like look at the physical, where you are physically, and then see where it's going to be completed. And it could definitely, as the construction site is developed, you have just the steel, you're in the gymnasium and you can see where the basketball hoop's going to be, or the bleachers are going to be, or anything else, with that. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities with the augmented reality side in the future. I'm very excited. We were just talking about like the laser scanning. That's just going to get more and more cost effective, more and more economical. People are going to use it more. Heck, I was scanning the other day this house for this construction company and another architect, and the one guy texts me as I'm doing the scan. He's like, "Hey, I just drove down such and such a street. There was another guy with that same camera you had, doing something else." And I was like, "Yep, get used to it. You're going to see it more and more."
It's true.
Yeah.
It does seem to, there's circumstances that seem to be fast tracking some of the adoption rates, which I appreciate. So very clearly you were passionate about what you do and how you do it. If folks wanted to reach out to you and decided they were going to make you their mentor, how do they get a hold of you? Is there, anything that you'd like to share with them?
Sure. My basic contact is, through my firm, Dauntless Design Collaborative. The website is dauntlessdc.com, DC like Washington, DC, or Design Collaborative. Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, Dauntless Design Collaborative. I believe it's Dauntless DC on Instagram. And then I also have a podcast called Rich the Architect. And I have a page on Facebook and Instagram, Rich the Architect, as well. The Instagram one's kind of like, that's more like my personal thing. So you'll see pictures of like, my kid and I in our gardens on our farm and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed our time. I'm so glad that you reached out. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem, Lindsay. Yeah. Appreciate being on, and hope to maybe be on sometime in the future as well.